All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. And we're going to talk about more about undefined behavior in the IR and talk about undefined values and Poisson values and also the freeze of code in LLVM, etc. Over to you, Aditya.
Yes, so the first thing we'll be talking about is why we need undefined values and what was the problem with previous values defined. So far we've had undefined behavior and Poisson. So now we are going to introduce a new value called the undef value. And the reason we have to introduce this is because the IR has to cater to multiple languages, all of which have different semantics. And for example, some languages like C may say that accessing an uninitialized value is undefined behavior, and others will say just assign a random value or maybe some constant value like 0 or some other default value. So we need to be able to support all of these semantics, and we can't do that with Poisson. For example, if we take this example, if this is Poisson, X is Poisson, then Y is also Poisson, and printing a Poisson value might lead to some unexpected behavior, like it'll lead to an error or it'll trigger UB or something else, which is not the expected behavior. We need to somehow be able to print a random value. So to do that, we introduce the undef value, and undef is a bit less non-deterministic than Poisson, and it basically represents an unspecified bit pattern of its type. So if we have an I8 type variable which is assigned undef, then it can take all values from 0 to 2 to the power 8 minus 1. So when we are transforming programs with undef, we need to make sure that the target program can only exhibit a subset of the behaviors of the source program. If it can exhibit a superset, then that's an invalid transformation. And what this informally means is that we are allowed to go from a higher level of non-determinism to a lower level, but not the other way around. So 7 is one of the values that undef can take. So we can go from undef in the source to 7, but if we go from 7 to undef, that's invalid. So assuming wraparound semantics here, all of these transformations can be reduced to undef because um, for any value that A can take in the target program, in the source program, the same value can be obtained by choosing a different value for undef. For example, if we wanted 10 here and B was 7, then undef can be chosen as 3 in order to get the same value 10. So whatever the target program can A can take, the source program can also do that. So these transformations are all valid. So now here's an invalid transformation. Let's say B was 1, then the bit pattern will be restricted to having a 1 in its lowest least significant bit, and this means this can take only odd values, whereas this can take both even and odd values. And since the target program can take values that are not even there in the source program, this transformation is invalid. However, if instead of transforming to undef, if we transformed it to B, then this transformation is valid. And we can see this by simply setting undef to 0. We get OR of B comma 0 is B itself. And the undef value has an additional property that each time it is observed, it can return a different bit pattern. What this implies is that if you do XOR of undef comma undef, it need not be 0. Typically, XOR of something with itself is 0, but it need not be 0 here because the first undef could be 7 and the second undef could be 3. It can take different bit patterns. However, it is valid to say that undef XOR undef is undef itself because we're basically considering XOR of all possible pairs because the undefs can take any number. And here's another example of the same property. A plus A is basically undef plus undef, and it represents the B is therefore undef. Whereas in this program, undef into 2 can only be even values. So here, since it can be both odd and even values, b mod 2, asserting that b mod 2 is 0 is invalid because it can also be 1. But here it's fine to assert that c must be 0 because it's only even values, and even values mod 2 is 0. In this module, we'll be talking about what are the undef operational semantics. And undef basically represents a set of values from which it returns a value each time it is observed. If its set is a set of even numbers, then each time it is observed, it can return an even number, and similarly for other cases. And there are two types of undef values: fully undef value and a partially undef value. A fully undef value represents the entire range that type can have. So if it's I8, then X can be anything from 0 to 255, which is the entire range that variable of that type can have. And here's an example of a partially undef value. This is partially undef because we multiply it with 2, and what that results in is that the set becomes a set of even numbers. We basically multiply each element with 2. So 0 into 2 is 0, 1 into 2 is 2, 2 into 2 is 4, and so on. And this leaves us with a set of even numbers. And since this is a subset of the full range, we call this a partially undef value. And similarly, we can go from undef to, just like we can go from undef to partially undef, we can go from undef to fully deterministic as well. So if we multiply undef with 0, any number multiplied with 0 is 0. So z can only return 0. And in this way, this z becomes deterministic. It's also acceptable to say that this is a partially undef value with a singleton set of 0, and both of the semantics are equivalent. It's fine to say either. And yeah, this I already covered. So for the implications of what this kind of semantic mean, so branching on undef is considered undefined behavior. So the alternative is to branch non-deterministically. So if it's 0, it could go to the false branch, and 1, if 1 is observed, it could go to the true branch. And so every time it's observed, it can non-deterministically choose between the true and false branch. But the problem is that this interferes with the normal kind of transformation that the compiler usually performs, such as dead code elimination. If we say branching on undef is undefined behavior, then that entire the branching blocks are considered dead code because this code is assumed unreachable. So the implications of assuming branching on undef is UB is that when we are hosting, for example, we're taking this inner if branch and making it A and B. This was UB with poison. This was invalid with poison, but with undef it's valid because um, this is if A is false. The counterexample we considered for poison was that A is false and B is undef. A is false, this is never executed. But here, if A is false and B is undef, then false and undef is false again. Any boolean value and with false is false again. So this becomes false, and this block is never executed. So the source and target exhibit the same behavior, and so this transformation is valid. But loop unswitching is invalid. So the counterexample is once again A is equal to false and B is equal to undef. So when A is equal to false, the body is never executed for this loop. And when B is undef, this if B will be UB. So the target program is exhibiting UB when the source is not. So this is not a valid transformation. And the implications for memory is that if address is either partially or fully undef, then the abstract machine cannot figure out where to store it. There can be many possible candidate locations. So this is UB. However, if the value is undef, it's not UB, it's well defined, and the corresponding address is simply set to undef. And since the address is, if it's partially or fully undef, since it's UB, hoisting for these instructions is disabled. For division by undef, if u is partially or fully undef, then x by u is going to be ub, because undef, provided that undef has u in as one of its possible values, because division by 0 is ub. And the select instruction, if A and B are either undef or Poisson, then it's well defined and the value corresponding to the condition is returned. But if C is undef or Poisson, some special things take place. So C is undef, then one of A and B is chosen non-deterministically. And if C is Poisson, then any operation on Poisson should return Poisson. So the entire operation becomes Poisson. And this is similar to branching, but we don't say that if the condition is Poisson or undef, it should be UB, because the select operation is not as flexible as branch. We can't do load, store, in or any other instruction in the body. We can simply return an expression or a variable or a register. So for the select instruction, we don't trigger UB. So now we'll discuss why we chose the particular semantics we did for undef, like why should branch on undef should be UB. So undef is allowed to yield different values when observed at different points, because this relieves the compiler from having to save and restore garbage values. It saves register space, and it also obeys the replace all uses with semantics of the IR. Because if A is undef and we have x is equal to a plus a, then the compiler typically might do constant propagation and other such transformation, and it might replace x is equal to a plus a with x is equal to undef plus undef. And to support such transformation and not disable them, we allow for um, undef to have different values. And branching on undef and Poisson is UB, because the global value numbering transformation is valid only if branch on undef and Poisson is UB. So let us say it wasn't UB. Let us say branch on undef is non-deterministically chosen, and the counterexample is x is equal to 1 and u is equal to undef. Then the source will have f of this will be 1 is equal to undef, and the whole expression will be undef. So let's say the compiler decided to non-deterministically execute this body. The source would have f of 1 and the destination would have f of undef. So the target has more non-determinism than the source, and that is invalid. However, if branch on undef is UB, then this code is both the target and the source is UB and therefore unreachable, and the code doesn't the compiler doesn't have to consider the particular case. So between Poisson and undef, Poisson is the more non-deterministic one, and here's an example of that. So undef into 2 can only be even numbers, so we can't transform it to x is equal to 1. Whereas Poisson into 2 is simply Poisson, and we can transform it to any value which we want, which includes x is equal to 1. And since Poisson is more non-deterministic of the two, Poisson can be converted to undef, but the reverse is invalid. And we're concerned with the relative non-determinism of values, because the more non-determinism we have in the source program in the transformation, the more optimization opportunities we have. And therefore, if we have a Poisson value as opposed to an undef value in the source, then that means we have more optimization opportunities. For example, if we have this code where ND, let's say it's either undef or Poisson, and we'll consider it case by case. So if ND is Poisson, then any operation on Poisson is Poisson, and therefore branch on Poisson is undef, and this entire operation, this expensive operation, can simply be ignored or deleted. And if it is undef, however, we can't do that, because operations on undef need not necessarily be undef. They can become deterministic, well-defined values. So we can't do the same thing we do for Poisson. And let's consider this transformation. Let's say we have to consider different semantics for signed integer overflow. So let's say we consider wraparound semantics. In the case we assume wraparound semantics, then this transformation is invalid, because let's say int max is n is equal to int max, then int max plus 1 will become int min, and this will always be false. Whereas I is less than or equal to int min, int max will always be true. So the target program is exhibiting behaviors the source program does not, and therefore this transformation is invalid. However, let's say signed integer overflow is poison or undef. So int max plus 1 will be either poison or undef, and this will just be int max, and this will always be true. And here we'll have either I lesser than poison or I lesser than undef. And if it's I lesser than poison, it's going to become poison branching on poison as UB, so we don't need to consider the case. And if it's I lesser than undef, then it's once again going to be undef. We can choose the values of undef such that we either get true or false. And that's going to be undef again. And so that's again going to trigger UB. So since int max triggers UB, we don't need to consider that case in this transformation. And for all other values, this transformation is defined. So if integer overflows either poison or undef, then this transformation is valid. Once again, considering that signed integer overflow is poison or undef, this transformation might or might not be invalid. So let's say signed integer overflow is poison, then this transformation is valid because a plus x will be poison, and this makes the entire operation poison, and poison can be transformed to any value, so it's fine to transform it to this value. However, if the signed integer overflow is undef, this transformation is invalid, and the counter example is a is equal to int max and x is equal to 1. So int max plus 1 will become undef, and this will be int max, and anything compared with int max, undef lesser than int max is always going to be, sorry, undef lesser than int max will always be false, because nothing is greater than int max, and the target, since this is 1, this will be 1 greater than 0 and will always evaluate to true. They're evaluating to completely different values. The source is evaluating to false and the target is evaluating to true. So in case signed integer overflows undef, this transformation is invalid. In all the examples we saw that if we had poison, then the transformation was valid, but if we had undef, then the transformation was invalid. Namely, poison is better for optimization. Then why do we have undef? Because even though undef is slightly suboptimal for optimization, sometimes we need it to give certain semantics. Like when we discuss the motivation for undef gives us more predictable behavior, such as when we print an uninitialized variable, and when we need certain language semantics, we need undef. And this is not related to optimization, but this is related to programmability and what the programmer expects. So far we've discussed undef and how it contrasts with poison. Now we'll explore the limitations of both and introduce a new opcode. So the limitations with poison and undef is that they invalidate a bunch of transformations like loop unswitching and hoisting. And furthermore, since undef can return different values on different observations, certain transformations which might involve this example with strength reduction might be disabled. So for as to why this transformation is invalid, if we consider x is equal to undef and y is equal to 1, in both cases a is going to be undef, because undef divided by 1 is undef, and undef mod 1 is going to be 0, because undef has to choose a particular value from the range, and any value chosen from the range mod 1 is going to be 0. Whereas here a into y is going to be undef and x is also undef, so undef minus undef is undef. And we can see that the target b is equal to undef is there and the source b is equal to 0 is there. The target cannot have more non-determinism than the source, so this transformation is invalid. So we introduce poison and undef to be able to carry out certain optimization, because they gave us more optimization opportunities, and it's not a good idea for them to disable a lot of the transformation that the compiler normally uses. So we need a way to bring those transformations back, and the way to do that is using the freeze opcode. So if we freeze a variable and that variable is already well defined, it simply returns the same value of that variable. However, if that variable is non-deterministic, it has either undef or poison, then it simply picks an arbitrary value out of the set of all possible values that variable could have had. So if we had I8 undef, y is equal to I8 undef, then x could be anything from 0 to 255, and x is considered as a well-defined value. It doesn't have the different observations, different values, properties of undef, etc. X is the same as a well-defined value. So let's see how using freeze we can enable some transformations that were previously disabled. So loop unswitching was not possible earlier. However, if we freeze B before putting it in the condition um, of this branch, then it's no longer UB, because even if we get undef or poison in B, it's going to be frozen to a well-defined value, and branching on well-defined value is well-defined and not UB. So this transformation is now valid. And the counter example that previously failed for us, A is equal to false and B is equal to undef or poison, works because now this value will be frozen. This was previously giving us UB, whereas the source was simply not executing the body. But this is no longer UB. This will become well-defined because we're branching on a well-defined value. And select to so select with undef or poison, the condition operand had was not UB, whereas branching on the same condition operand would be UB. So we can transform from select to branching by using freeze on the condition operand. So even if the condition operand was undef or poison, it will now be well defined because we froze it. So with all of these non-deterministic types, we now have a range or spectrum of non-determinism and different degrees of non-determinism. So we have the most non-deterministic, which is UB, and the least non-deterministic, which is well-defined. And if we have the more non-determinism we have in the source, the more optimization opportunities we have. So as we go from right to left, we get more optimization opportunities if these values are in the source. But if these values are in the target program, as we go from left to right, we get lesser and lesser flexibility of the generated program because we can't optimize it any further. And this gives us, as we go from right to left, we get more optimization opportunities because the set of values from which we get to pick uh, a subset to go to the target program is larger if we go to the right, if we go to the left. And in the generated program, as we go to the right, we get smaller and smaller set of values from which to transform further. So when freeze is present on the target side, it enables optimization, whereas if it is present on the source side, it disables optimization because it essentially turns a non-deterministic value into a deterministic value. And we know that if we have a deterministic value in the source side, it's going to give us less optimization opportunities, and it makes sense that it disables optimization. And due to this particular nature of freeze, depending on how we use it and how careful we are when using it, it can thwart or enable certain optimizations. So here's an optimization that was earlier disabled with freeze. Not earlier. This will be disabled with freeze in a particular use case. So we can go from here to here, but when we try to transform it from here to here, will it just one second. When we go from here to here, is it possible or not? Since we're freezing the entire expression, the transformation is valid because signed integer overflow is considered poison, and so freeze of poison can be true or false. And it is possible for the compiler to always choose true in this case. Just like in the target program, since this is int max, this is always going to be true. The compiler can choose true here all the time, and so this transformation is valid. However, if we had a different statement here, like I is lesser than freeze of n plus 1, this transformation is invalid because no value that the freeze can take will ensure that I is always lesser than this value, because I will eventually become int max and this condition has to become false, whereas the target will always be true. And in this, if freeze is used in this way, then the source and target will diverge, and in that case the transformation is invalid. And this transformation is valid. This is not valid, this is invalid. um, so the problem with this is that earlier with undef we were able to give different valuations for the same variable, but once we freeze it we can't do that. So here we want b is equal to 2 and c is equal to 3, and in order to get b is equal to 2 this needs to be 1, and in order to get c is equal to 3 this needs to be 3 or all ones or something. So we can't have different valuations and this transformation becomes invalid. However, the compiler can reason out and change the target program so as to make the transformation valid. The compiler can reason out that since this is frozen, whatever value is used here, the same value can be used here, and we can get a corresponding target program. So if the compiler chooses 1 for A, then we could get B is equal to 2 and C is equal to 1. So this serves to show that if freeze is recklessly used, then transformations might be thwarted, but with some reasoning on the part of the compiler and proper use of freeze, the same transformations can be enabled. However, the catch is that the compiler has to work harder to find those same transformations. And so here's another example of transformation which was previously invalid, but it's now valid with freeze. So we can just freeze this particular value, and now global value numbering becomes valid. So this transformation, which uses the select operation, this becomes invalid because once again we expect the different valuations property of undef, but once we freeze it, we can no longer do that. The if y is not equal to b, there's no way this can be valid. So that covers undef, poison, and freeze, and all forms of non-determinism in LLVM. Now we'll be discussing intro to certain static analysis approaches, and let us say this is a picture of the possible execution trajectories a program can follow and what it's not supposed to do. So this is one trajectory of the program, and a forbidden zone. These red things are the forbidden zones, and they are not supposed, and they lead to system failure, such as segfault, etc., and make the entire system crash. And so, in critical systems, we don't want that these program execution trajectories cross through these forbidden zones, and that is the objective we'd like. And so testing is an one approach. This approach basically tries out various input instances and checks if those execution trajectories cross the forbidden zone or not. The problem with this is that the unchecked input instances might still cross through the forbidden zone and we would never know it. So this is neither sound nor complete because uh, just because a particular test suite says that it doesn't cross the forbidden zone doesn't mean that the program cannot cross the forbidden zone, because an unchecked instance might. And the next approach is bounded model checking, which exhaustively checks all input instances up to a certain range. Here's an example. We can check all values of n up to 10,000, but the problem with this is still not sound, because the 10,001th value might cause the program to go into the forbidden zone or the region. And furthermore, it's also hard to scale because we need to exhaustively test all values. And the third approach is abstract interpretation, which rather than reasoning with the actual program, it abstracts out certain parts of the program, and in doing so, it makes the abstraction over approximate, and it tries to reason with that abstraction and show that the abstraction does not cross through to the forbidden zone. And what this can be thought of is that this tries to construct an over approximate enclosure that encloses all possible execution trajectories. if we manage to create a successful over approximate abstraction and we show that that doesn't cross into the forbidden zone, then it necessarily means that the original program will also not cross into the forbidden zone, because the abstraction is supposed to enclose all possible trajectories. So this is one of the methods which actually guarantees soundness. Um, and however, if we fail to find an abstraction, that doesn't mean the program will necessarily not cross into the program will necessarily cross into a forbidden zone. It just means that the algorithm was incapable of constructing an abstraction that doesn't cross into the forbidden zone. So this shows that the method is not necessarily complete. Failure to find the abstraction doesn't mean that the program is incorrect. The next approach we have is bug finding tools, which basically try to expand the region around a particular execution trajectory through methods such as fuzzing, which can take one test case and fuzz it so to get more test cases and so on. So that's how we expand the neighborhood. And this approach, just like bug finding, is just like testing, is neither sound nor complete, because there's always the possibility that an unchecked instance can go into the forbidden zone. So soundness, the properties of soundness and completeness that we were discussing so far, soundness is guaranteed when if the tool finds no proof of if the tool finds proof of no violations, then it implies that there are actually no violations in the program. Then we get soundness. And if we can say that if there exists no possible violation, then the tool will definitely find a proof, then that guarantees completeness. That concludes the presentation.
Right. Thanks, Aditya, for that nice presentation. Yeah, I find this whole topic of undefined poison very, very interesting, because it's like these corner cases add so much complexity um, to, to compiler design. And honestly, I don't think we have a full handle on these problems yet. By we, I mean we as in the world has a full handle on these problems yet, and these things are still in progress. So yeah, let's open the floor for questions. Yeah, Setu.
Hi. So I wanted to ask about partial undef. So we talked about that how after applying certain operations on undef, we can actually result with a partially undef value, right? So we were talking. So we were talking about smaller values, which is 8-bit values. So we could just potentially store all the potential values in an array, then check it out. But as we move towards higher, the larger data types, it would not be possible to store each and every possible value. And then for further analysis, we cannot just loop over the array and figure out whether it's a valid value or not. So how exactly are partial indef encoded in the code itself?
Uh, okay, let me try to repeat the question so you can tell me whether I understood the question correctly or not. I mean, your final question is how are partial undef values encoded in the code itself? So,
Yes.
so there is no, I mean, the programmer cannot, there is no, so at least in LLVM, there's no way for the programmer to say, oh, this is a partial undef value that can only take even numbers, right? So there's no keyword for that. The only way you can do it is by constructing an expression. So by the way, LLVM does give you a way to construct a fully undef value. There's a keyword called undef in LLVM. And if you use undef, then that basically means the fully undef value for that particular type. And that's really the primary reason why we even distinguish between fully undef and partially undef values. Because I mean, at the end of the day, like what is an undef value, whether irrespective of whether it's partially or fully, it's a value that that represents more than one values, and each time it's observed, any of those set of values can be returned. So that's what an undef value is. And for fully undef, that set is basically the entire set for that particular type. And for partial undef, it's some subset of that full set. Now, LLVM, for example, gives you a way of specifying a keyword called undef, which allows you to say that this is a fully undef value. And then if you kind of, do some operations on it, for example, you multiply it by 2, then you have constructed a partially undef value in the destination. And that's the only way to construct a partially undef value in the destination. Other than that, there's no representation required. Notice that this is all at the IR level, right? And when we are talking about, so let's say I was going to execute, in reality, the IR is never really executed directly. IR is first compiled into assembly, and then the assembly is executed. So when you compile IR into assembly, you typically make some deterministic choice for the undef values, because assembly does not have the concept of undef, right? So at that point, you have to basically, because at that point, you're basically saying, okay, now I'm done with my optimization, let's determinize. I mean, it's almost like freeze or something like that, right? So you just basically freeze the values and you kind of get the assembly, and then you execute. And so that's fine. So that's what happens on the machine. So at the machine level, at the hardware level, of course, there are no sets being maintained or anything like that. But oftentimes, what you want is you want to do execution on the abstract machine. So recall that when we talk about compilers or we talk about programming language semantics, we talk about abstract machines. So there's a C abstract machine, which is going to execute the C semantics. That's how we represent the operational semantics of the C language. Similarly, we have an LLVM abstract machine that basically represents the operational semantics of the LLVM language. So the only place where you would need to keep track of all these sets and things like that is at the abstract machine level. And typically you would be doing this at the abstract machine level if you are interested in doing validation of your transformations or something like that. It's more about analyzing whether your transformations are correct at the IR level, or some other kind of analysis that you want to do at the IR level. Because all this complexity doesn't translate to assembly. So yeah, at the, if you're executing the abstract machine of LLVM, then you would be basically keeping track of this fact. Okay, so this was a fully undef value. All right, so that means let me represent it with a whole set, which is a full set of all the values. Now, how do I represent that set? Of course, I can use my own representation of the set. One thing is I enumerate each and every value, but as you pointed out, if the range is large, for example, 64-bit number, of course, it makes no sense to actually enumerate each and every value. Maybe you want to have a succinct representation of that value, and similarly for partial undef. So once again, if you want to represent a partially undef value, one option is to kind of enumerate all the elements that are possible, but that is expensive both from a computational point of view and from a storage point of view. So typically people will not do it. First of all, you need to do it only for the abstract machine execution. Even when you're doing it for the abstract machine, you don't really, it would be prohibitively expensive in many cases to kind of represent sets as actually individual elements, collection of individual elements. So you would have some representation that would be right. And one simple representation, by the way, is the expression representation itself. So for example, you say, this is 2 into undef. So 2 into undef is a representation of a set, a partial undef value, and that's a fine representation. Only thing is, if you want to reason about it, now you don't need to understand what is 2 into undef. But 2 into undef is a succinct representation of all the even numbers in that type.
Yeah, got it. Just one more question. So we talked about this select statement, the ternary operator, right? And we talked about that if the conditional itself is undefined, then what I get is a partially undefined value because I could take either of the values A or B. And we talked about if A itself is undefined, then the output which I get would be dependent on what the value is C, right? But that is a decision which I can make at runtime. Let's say I'm analyzing certain piece of code, I'm probably analyzing it for some certain optimization, and I come across a statement which says that Z is equal to select C, undef, A, something like that. So what would I assign Z in this case? I cannot just say that Z would take either undef or P depending on C, because I do not have C at this point. It's a runtime variable, right? I do not really know what C is. So what would I assign to Z in this case?
So first of all, everything we are talking is at runtime, right? We are talking about the operational semantics of the undef value. So and if you're asking me the question that if the code that I execute, the abstract machine executes is select C undef A, right? Select C comma undef comma A, then what would be the target? What would be the result of the value, and what would be stored in the target? And the answer is, so let's say so the answer is actually undef, because basically what will happen is that you need to take the union of undef and A. And undef already is a fully undef value, then the union of undef with A is just the fully undef value. On the other hand, if the undef was actually a partially undef value, maybe it was undef into 2. So let's say it was select of C comma undef into 2 comma A.
Yeah.
And let's say I know that A can either be, let's say A is definitely 1, let's say, all right? So then what I get back is a set which is all the even numbers and the odd number called 1. And so that's what it'll become.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, Jay.
Hi. So just adding to Setu's question, so you said that I mean LLVM does not have a notion of a partially undef value or something. So if I have value x that is undef and I do y equals 2 into x, I mean I know that y will take the value, all the even values, but since LLVM does not have a notion of that, it will just say that y is undef and then do some analysis on that, or how does that happen?
I never said that LLVM does not have the notion of partially undervalued. That's not what I said. I said LLVM does not provide a keyword that says, okay, this is a partially undervalued. LLVM does provide a keyword called this is a fully undervalued. So that's the undef keyword. So the programmer can just type undef, and that basically represents a fully undervalued. But the programmer cannot just type, there's no way to say that give me all the even numbers. The only way to say that is to construct an expression from a fully undef value.
Right.
So what I'm saying is in the syntax of LLVM, there is no way to specify a partial undef value as a simple constant. You can construct a partially undef value using expressions, but not as a single constant.
Okay.
But that does not mean that the LLVM does not have the notion of partially undef value. LLVM, of course, has the notion of partially undef value because that's what the semantics are.
Yeah. Okay. Also,
so I'd like to add to that. Similarly, just like LLVM does not support syntactically the notion of partial undef values, LLVM also does not support syntactically the notion of Poisson values. So there's no keyword called Poisson in LLVM. Okay, because probably the designers didn't feel the need to add such a keyword. The only reason you can generate a Poisson value is through some expressions. For example, you can write an instruction called add int max comma 1, and then that's definitely going to be Poisson. Or if you say add x comma 1, then it will be Poisson if x was int max at runtime, right? So I mean, what is available syntactically is different, is a subset of what is available semantically in the language.
okay, so
I would like to take that further. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I'd like to take that further. Even when I look at the C language, for example, right? I mean, I can't say, oh, this is undefined behavior. I mean, there's no kind of textual way of saying that this something is undefined behavior. But if certain things happen, then that semantics. From a semantic point of view, there's the notion of undefined behavior. From a syntactic point of view, there's no notion of specifying something is undefined behavior. So it's the same thing at the LLVM level as well. Yeah.
So it does not have a keyword syntactically, but LLVM does so by just maybe, let's say, as you said, by tracking an expression. So like this value was 2 into undef or something like that. Okay. And also we saw that like we saw what could happen if you want to hoist a value out of the loop above the loop in case of let's say if the value was freeze, or it was undef, or it was Poisson. But can we do the reverse? And I think it may not be possible to do it in case of freeze, but So in some cases, we may want to, hoist down the value down in the loop.
You mean sync? So the
Yeah.
opposite of hoist is sync. Okay, so you want to sync the.
I mean, let's say what happens if we are syncing undef or poison or freeze?
Oh, syncing undef or poison in a branch. So in other words, syncing UB.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, if there was some UB in the program, potential UB in the program, and you kind of sync it, is that okay to do? Right. That's the question.
Yeah.
So notice that when we got worried about hoisting because when we hoisted, then basically what happened was certain computations were happening on code paths, on certain code paths on which it was not originally happening, but now starts happening. For example, there was an if loop, or there was an if condition or a while condition, and earlier some computation was only happening if the condition was true. But now when we hoisted it, that computation happens also on the path where it was false. And that was the only reason that we didn't like that kind of optimization, or that optimization was invalid, because it's now, basically you are making the optimization, you're computing that expression on more parts of the program than it was originally being computed on. And if that computation could trigger UB, then some paths on which it would never have triggered UB now have become UB paths. So that was the problem with hoisting. And so it's not about moving things up or down. If for example it was a straight line piece of code, it's very okay. It's completely okay to keep hoisting as much as possible. You just bring it all the way to the top of the program. No problem whatsoever, because after all, it was going to get executed anyway. It was going to get executed later. I executed it earlier. It's not an illegal transformation, because our semantic says we have to run the program till completion. So whether it triggers UB 10 minutes down the line or right now, if it's going to definitely trigger UB, I can trigger it now. It doesn't really matter. So I mean the same. So once we agree on that, then the answer on your question becomes kind of straightforward, because even syncing, as long as we are not introducing the computation on extra code paths, we are perfectly okay. Right. So for example, if it was an if condition, so let's say there was if C and there was some computation E inside the if block. Now of course I can't sync E below the if block, because that would make, if E could trigger UB, then that would basically make UB appear on more paths in the target than it was present in the source.
So let's say I have a free statement and I read it. Let's say I have a y. I have x equals freeze y, and y could be either poison or undef, and I read it again. So if I read a freeze value again, then I can potentially get different values, right?
No, I mean, if it's already frozen, then you'll always, I mean, it's just like any other value, right?
No, like for example, let's say if I had a free statement outside the loop and I sank it into the loop.
Okay.
Then I'll read multiple. I can read different free frozen values in the loop dynamically.
Okay, sure.
Versus before statically, I just had one value that was loop invariant.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So
in this case, we probably cannot sync free statement, right?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. That's about syncing the freeze statement, yeah. So freeze is the opposite of UB, right? I mean, in the sense that UB is like, like some explosion has happened, like something really, now anything can happen from here on. Freeze is like you're determinizing things, so you're actually making things more deterministic. So if you sync freeze from before the loop, so firstly, these are two different ideas. I mean, they're like almost opposite ideas, right? In one case, it's about non-determinism. In the other case, it's about determinism. So yeah, I guess the question you're asking is, if I sync freeze, then I can potentially increase non-determinism, because as you said, the freeze was actually upfront, and now I sank it into the loop, so I've increased non-determinism, and that may not be may not be the right thing to do. So yeah, so when you sync freeze, you can. So basically, what you have done is so that's a good point. I mean, just like UB cannot be introduced in extra paths, freeze cannot be removed from certain paths. I mean, you can't just say, okay, now it was frozen earlier, but now I have just removed the freezing. For example, in the example that you used, if the loop was never taken, then the freeze is not even getting executed or something like that. I mean that's just one example. But even inside it, it's getting frozen multiple times, and each time it can take a different value. So all these are basically adding more non-determinism, and that's not acceptable.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
All right. So, we talked about undefined behavior and then poison, undef, and then freeze. And kind of freeze is almost like, just the last step. And almost, I mean, when you convert IR to assembly, you're pretty much doing freezing anyway, and you can do that upfront so that, some transformations are possible, and you can voluntarily do some transformations like the ones shown. Now, the question I have is what are the constructs in C language that can generate, let's say, poison in C? That's question number one. Poison in LLVM. That's question number one. Undef in LLVM. That's question number two. And freeze in LLVM. It's question number three. I mean, maybe a little bit of a trick question, but okay. So how can you, I mean, from C, how do you get all these things in LLVM? What do you need to write in C so that you can generate something like of that sort in LLVM? Okay, I mean, I don't think it's such a. I mean, there's a little bit of. So the answer is, I mean, sometimes you cannot do that. So, but what about poison? I mean, that's easy, right? So how do you generate a poison value in LLVM?
Poison could be
Overflow.
internal plus one.
Sorry, yeah, I think there was a collision in the.
Poison could be int max plus one, right? So poison I can do directly.
Yeah, you can just say, I mean, you can just create some kind of operation that was UB in C. So by the way, C only has UB, right? C doesn't have. C also has the notion of indeterminate values, which is very similar to the undef concept in LLVM. The results of some competition can be indeterminate values. So yeah, poison is really easy. So firstly, generating UB in LLVM, you can just, for example, divide by 0 in C is just divide by 0 in LLVM. So UB in C can be translated directly into UB in LLVM using some operators like divide by 0 or illegal memory reference or something like that. Some operations in C can be converted to poison values in LLVM, such as signed integer overflow. Some operations in C, like reading uninitialized values. Right. So if I just declare a variable and then just read that variable. Now, there's been a lot of debate on how you should handle uninitialized values in C. One option is you can call that undefined behavior. And indeed, for many data types, that would be undefined behavior, because C has this notion of, because C needs to be a portable language and so on. Every language can have different representation of every type. And if something is uninitialized, maybe that representation is something that we cannot even understand what it is. And so we have to call it undefined behavior. So that's, but there have been, if you look at the C standard, you'll find that there's a lot of discussion on indeterminate values and things like that. So for certain types and under certain constraints, you can basically, if you read an uninitialized value, so if you just declare int x, then I start reading x, then in certain conditions, for example, if it's unsigned value and it's on a certain architecture and so on, this indeterminate value is not reading this this uninitialized value is not UB, but it is it's just going to give you a random bit pattern. And so that's exactly the undef value. That's exactly what the undef value is meant for. So you can generate the undef value from C by just declaring a variable and reading it for with the disclaimer under certain constraints for certain types and certain architecture. So, all right. In fact, you can try this for yourself. You can just write a small program where you write an uninitialized variable and you try to access it. Maybe you try to print it or something, and you can see what LLVM gets generated for that program. And even though you would find that LLVM actually generates the undef value for reading an uninitialized variable. Now you may find that surprising because, as I said, I mean, for many types and for in the general case, reading an undefined behavior and an initialized variable can be UB. So why is it generating an undef value? Any answer on that? Well, I guess the LLVM designers didn't want to get into all this debate of what is right and what should the right semantics should be, and they just chose a safer option. The safer option is the more deterministic option. And what's the more deterministic option? Undef is the most deterministic. I mean, there were three options, right? Either you could have said it's a UB, or you could have said it was poison, or you could have said it's undef. Those are the three possibilities at the LLVM level. And the third one is the safest, in the sense that even if the C designers choose something else like UB or poison, well, the C designers won't have poison, but let's say they chose UB or undeterminate value, both of them are covered by undef, because poison and UB can always be converted to undef, but not the other way around. So they use the undef value in that case.
So I mean, that's just like one implementation that they decided to, I mean, so just go with some subset that's undef. So I mean, some other I mean, implementation could have done something else because it's UB, and so it does not matter, right?
Yes, but also, I mean, it's a little bit more complicated in if what the C semantics say. As I was saying, like for certain data types under certain constraints, you can reason that this is going to be an indeterminate value and not a UB. So I mean, the LLVM guys don't want to kind of, and it keeps changing across standards, right? I mean, not like it keeps changing every year or something, but across decades or something, it has changed. So all this becomes overwhelming for the developer, by the way, right? Because the developer, I mean, most people don't really read the standards with such care. And in fact, it's almost impossible to read. I mean, unless you are doing research in the area, reading those hundreds of pages of standard in such depth is pretty impractical. And so this is a very nice kind of example of how people have found a sweet spot of what to do, so that programmers don't feel surprised and frustrated by what why did you okay, it's uninitialized, but that doesn't mean you just kind of don't just come and remove the whole program or something like that. Should have just used an indeterminate value. And so that's what the LLVM designers choose to do, even for C. Of course, when you generate LLVM from other languages, then you could then those languages would explicitly say that this is undef, or they would explicitly say that this is some indeterminate value, but it is chosen and it will remain the same all through. In which case, you would probably get to use the freeze opcode in LLVM, right? So in that case, you're saying, okay, it's some indeterminate value, but I don't know, but it's going to remain the same. It's not like every time I read it, it's going to be a different value. So then that you get to use the freeze opcode. But I cannot think of any way that you can generate freeze from C directly. I mean, the optimization pipeline can generate freeze. as we have seen in some of the examples that we discussed. For example, if I want to do loop unswitching or something like that, I'm forced to emit the freeze opcode. Otherwise, the transformation is invalid. But directly from C, probably not. Not to my knowledge so far, at least. Okay.
So just one thing. So what would it mean to generate freeze directly from C, right? Because if I'm generating freeze directly from C, isn't it exactly equal to having a normal variable, right? Because freeze, what would that mean, right? If I generate
So, I
freeze
mean, for
from
example, the LLVM designers could have decided that, if it's an uninitialized variable, then I'm going to assume that it has some value. It's some garbage value, but I'm going to preserve that value forever. I mean, it's not like every time I read it, I can get a different value. So if that's what the LLVM designers had decided, they could have chosen to use freeze for the initialized variable, but they chose to use undef because undef gives more optimization opportunity and is still an acceptable choice from a programmability point of view.
So what does the C standard say? Like, does the C standard specify how should we handle this? I mean, I can choose a subset of those possibilities. That's fine. But what exactly does the standard say? Does it say that? Yeah.
So the C standard says, so for certain types like signed integers and things like that, or floating point, and uninitialized value, accessing an uninitialized value is actually undefined behavior. Because the floating point value could, potentially, like accessing it could potentially trigger a hardware exception on some architectures or something like that. And so that's just undefined behavior. For certain and certain constraints, like maybe unsigned values on certain architectures, you can say the programmer can reasonably expect that, okay, I should get an indeterminate value, and that's the same thing as saying undef in LLVM.
Thank you.
And so this has been a long-standing debate, by the way, on how to handle uninitialized variables in a programming language like C. C being a poster child of a very widely used performance-critical programming language. One school of thought is that every time an uninitialized variable is accessed, that's an error. Another school of thought says, so what if I accessed an uninitialized value? If I'm just copying it around, for example, I did a mem copy on the uninitialized value. So what? I mean, like I didn't really use it. I just mem copied it. And by the time I got to using it, I actually, maybe multiplied it with 0 and then used it, or I wrote something over it and then used it. So for example, I could have an uninitialized value. On some path, I initialize it, and later on, I do a mem copy on both paths, on the join point. And should that trigger UB? And some people will say, it's really stupid for you to kind of trigger UB in this case. And others will say, why? I mean, but this, like, you shouldn't be writing such code. You should explicitly initialize it to 0. And so I guess the debate is between one set of guys that says, who want to be purists and say, every time you access an uninitialized value, that's UB. Others say, only if you do computation that involves uninitialized value, should you say it's UB. Copying it around should not be UB. Okay, and I guess the debate will always go on. In fact, another very famous debate is between the Linux kernel developers and the C language developers. I don't know, is somebody aware of this debate? It's related to the signed integer overflow. Oh, okay. So this is basically, you can search for it and you'll find flame wars on mailing lists between Linux kernel developers and they like to call the other side language lawyers. So I mean, because they are so much caught up in the legalness of what language should support, that they call them language lawyers, and they don't like. I mean, their argument. So the sign. Just to explain what the problem is with the signed integer overflow kind of issues, undefined behavior. So Linux kernel developers like to hand optimize stuff a lot. And so they would explicitly, kind of do plus something so that it wraps around and it kind of comes back there or something like that. They would do that for pointers, for example, and so on. This is a very common paradigm in doing that. And for a long time, it was okay because the compilers were also not really exploiting that for optimization. But suddenly, someday, some people started writing some optimizations that were exploiting these semantics, and the Linux kernel started crashing or something like that, right? And so of course, so there's this kind of conflict, and this language designer, the kernel developers are saying, oh, there's a bug in your compiler. The language designers or GCC developers are saying that, oh, your program is wrong, and this is how it's supposed to be. And they say, okay, these semantics don't make sense. You should change the semantics. And say, you should have thought about that before you started writing in C, because these are the C semantics or something. I mean, I'm just making things up here a little bit, but I mean, that's the kind of argument that will go back and forth between them. And the resolution to this, by the way, is there is no resolution. The resolution is C language stays put. They keep their semantics intact because they say we design these very carefully, and they are good for optimization. Linux kernel developers decide to use GCC, and GCC agrees to support an extra flag, which is called no signed overflow flag, which basically disables all optimizations based on that kind of stuff. In fact, in one of our own research works, we kind of checked some of these compilers like LLVM to see how well they support the no signed overflow flag, and we found that GCC we couldn't find a bug, but we found bugs in ICC, for example, the Intel C compiler, where they don't, I mean, although they support the no signed overflow flag, they don't actually respect it fully, and so it would be very dangerous to compile Linux with ICC, at least the version that we checked it with. So these kind of issues remain, right? And so Linux kernel should be compiled with a certain compiler with certain options. Otherwise, you're not in a very safe zone. And so that becomes a problem. Yeah, I see a message by Aditya. He says, is this the Tannenbaum versus Torvalds debate? No, this is not the Tannenbaum versus Torvalds debate. That was much earlier. That was about Minix versus Linux. This is not that. Okay. Yeah, so that's that. So as you can see, I mean, this is a very contentious issue, and these are all corner case issues, but they become pretty big in the overall scheme of things. The other topic that we have discussed today is basically static analysis for identifying bugs or ensuring safety of software. Testing is by far the de facto approach that is being used in the huge, overwhelmingly large fraction of industry and research and stuff like that. I mean, that's how we typically do it. And testing has its own merits. Nothing can really replace testing, if you ask me, because at the end of the day, you can do static analysis, but you will never get the satisfaction until you see the thing working and actually producing output, just like you would expect it, you want it to. But testing has its merits, but it also has its demerits. It's not complete in any way. There are other approaches that kind of are, you can think of them as glorified testing, bounded model checking and fuzzing and things like that. The approach that we're going to really talk about is abstract interpretation, where basically we try to abstract the behavior of the program so that we can reason about its safety. So if we can reason about the safety of the abstraction, there are two things we have to prove there. First is that the abstraction is indeed an abstraction, which means that all the behaviors of the program, all the possible behaviors of the program are a subset of the possible behaviors of the abstraction. That's the first thing we'll have to prove. And the second thing we'll have to prove is that the abstraction itself can never do anything bad. Okay, and the example that I think that we've used in the lecture videos is that, let's say I have for I equals some initial value and some condition, let's say I is greater than equal to 0 and I is less than equal to n. And then I increment I by some unknown value. Now, the exact nature of possible behaviors of the program are going to be limited, because depending on how much I increment, maybe I increment by prime numbers or something like that. That's pretty complex kind of way of incrementing. But I can abstract and say, okay, let me just figure out whether this is safe for all possible values that are between 0 and 9. So that would be a 0 and n. So that would be an abstraction that has more behaviors, because it's allowing for I values to be more than what the actual program will have. And so that's what I mean when I say it's an abstraction. And so now, but this is what have we achieved with the abstraction? We have achieved a simpler representation of the program. And if we can prove properties of the simpler representation, then we have also proved the properties. Because it's an abstraction, we have also proved safe properties of the original program. And these are, what are called safety properties, in the sense nothing bad can happen. There are other types of properties as well of a program, for example, how fast it runs, or does it terminate, or things like that. But safety properties is not concerned about that. It's done, for example, it's not concerned about whether it terminates or not. It's only concerned that it doesn't do anything bad. It can run forever, but it shouldn't do anything bad. Okay, and that's what we're going to focus on in the first, in the rest of this course. I should point out that given the time that we have, we'll probably not get time to do those, get a sense of the entire idea of abstract interpretation. In fact, probably we'll, given the time we have, we'll only introducing the term abstract interpretation. We will get into the mechanics of how we do the proof obligations and things like that to show that nothing bad can happen. This is a much wider topic than what this course can cover. Yeah, just to say. Yeah, Jay.
So I mean, just a question, since we had a discussion about that Linux versus C language. So what kind of optimizations actually happen in the kernel? So like, for example, as you said that maybe we cannot have optimizations related to as in when overflow occurs or something, and also since a lot of loops in the kernel actually involve go-to statements and everything, so those are not natural loops at all. So they cannot have a lot of optimization that happen on natural loops. And also, since there are a lot of function calls that happen, so apart from a lot of trivial optimizations and let's say inlining, I don't see like a lot of optimizations happening. So what optimization actually happen in the kernel by the compiler?
Oh, by the compiler.
Yeah, I mean, let's say, I mean, so that's one thing that they hand optimize it. So I mean, yeah, so that's one. But what can the compiler do? What is it capable of?
Oh, I see. Oh, okay. And now I understand the question that you're asking. You're asking me, is there indeed enough scope for the compiler to optimize the Linux kernel that they're fighting over this, and they should just agree with the Linux developers? I mean, that's the spirit of the question, let's say. So, I mean, the compiler writers don't develop only for the. So you are right in saying that these kernel developers, they take pride in hand optimizing a lot of the stuff. Okay, which probably is not the best thing from a productivity angle. I mean, but I mean, they're very justified in doing that, because the compilers are not doing enough for them, and especially when they started writing all this, compilers were even weaker, so they had to do everything by hand. As the compilers improve, it's my personal opinion that the operating system should become higher and higher level, so that we take away the complexity from humans to machines, right, on doing these optimizations. But the thing is that compiler developers are not necessarily targeting the Linux kernel as their bread and butter benchmark, right? I mean, the compiler developers are basically targeting a very large variety of benchmarks where they want to do all these kind of optimizations, where the programmers have not hand optimized stuff very carefully. And Linux kernel just happens to be one of them. And so the compiler developers will add these optimizations, right? So, I mean, like the kind of stuff that we have discussed in our lecture modules, like I is less than n plus 1 to I is less than equal to n. For that, you require signed integer overflow semantics. And that if you disable that, then the Linux kernel will not be able to benefit from those optimizations. And so that's where the conflict comes from, right?
Yeah, so I mean, there's not much the compiler can do for kernel specifically.
No, I mean, even for the kernel, the compiler is probably doing a lot. I mean, see, the traditional bread and butter optimizations for kernel-like stuff is basically all kind. So as you said, inlining is a big one, and instruction selection and register allocation is another big one. More recently, I mean, a lot of stuff has been about vectorization and that kind of stuff, but kernel in particular is not so amenable to vectorization kind of things, although there may be some places where vectorization helps out. In fact, the kernel has its own constraints. For example, the kernel cannot use floating point registers at all. Also, and that's a choice that the kernel developers make. Why do they make that choice? Any ideas? Okay, let me give you another hint. Another choice that the kernel developers make is that they will use only a subset of the overall machine registers. For example, x86 has lots of different families of registers like XMM, AVA, this kind of stuff. Lots of stuff. I mean, MMX, floating point, of course, and so on. And they choose to restrict the usage of registers in the kernel to a small subset. Why?
So probably not everything would have an FPU, right? I might compile the Linux kernel for 10 different things. Not everything might have an FPU. So if I use floating point in my code, then that's going to give me. Yeah.
I mean, a kernel is typically compiled for a given architecture, right? So I know what the architecture is. I know there are all these registers available, and yet I decide to use small number of registers.
Floating point has numerical instability, maybe for that reason.
I mean, that's fine. I mean, I could have, I could use the floating point registers carefully, even if they have numeric instability. I could use them carefully.
It
I
could be
could,
for back compatibility purpose.
Sorry?
It could be for back compatibility purpose.
Backward compatibility. No, as I said, I mean, even when the Linux kernel developer knows, for example, they will have all kinds of preprocessor macros which says, okay, if it is this architecture, if this is supported, then use it. But even then, they don't like to use that thing.
Is it for context switching speed?
Yes. Who's that? Who's answering this?
Alvin.
Yeah. Hello, Alvin. Yeah, that's correct. So it's about context switching speed. Exactly. Because if the kernel starts using all these extra registers, then it needs to save and restore between context switches, and that causes extra context switch overhead, and so they decide not to use it. So yeah, that's another constraint that compilers have to. I mean, so it constrains the kind of optimization the compilers can do for the Linux kernel because the fewer registers available, and so fewer instructions available as a consequence, and so on. Yeah.
How does
Yeah, go ahead.
Why can't kernel developers create a fork of GCC for their particular use case? Too much effort.
Of course, I mean, see, software engineering is one of the biggest problems, right? I mean, like if right from the first lecture and compiler, I'm basically saying that compilers are super complex. LLVM is upwards of 3 million lines of code, and GCC is upwards of 18 million lines of code. So these are very specialist jobs, right? Expecting kernel developers to create a fork of GCC and start maintaining them. I mean, that could have been an argument from GCC guys that why don't you guys just do it yourself? But other than that, it's not a very practical thing to expect. But I mean, I guess they have a nice via media, right? I mean, basically they're saying that, okay, we're supporting these extra flags for you and you can use those flags. Like no sign and overflow and stuff. And by the way, I mean, it's interesting that you asked this question. I mean, I was just thinking that is it really true that the GCC guys are doing favor to the LLVM to the Linux kernel guys by making sure that by providing them the term compiler, because if they don't do a good job, then the Linux kernel guys. So in a way, but actually, it's a symbiotic relationship, right? It's not like the Linux kernel developers are dependent on GCC. It's also vice versa, because I mean GCC needs the kernel to run and so on. So they both have a fair standing, so to say, to be able to argue with each other. All right. So Jed, your hand is raised. Is that a question or okay? That's
No. Yeah.
okay. So let me just turn off the recording, I guess.